"This is old junk," my daughter-in-law snapped, tossing my life into the trash on Christmas morning. She wanted to flip my home for her Instagram followers, thinking I was just a depreciating asset. But as a history teacher, I know that foundations matter. I left with one bag and left behind one envelope. Now, after 112 missed calls, they are begging for mercy. But some lessons must be learned the hard way. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Edward Foster. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in Nashville, Tennessee, for most of my adult life. Bellevue, specifically, the quiet western side of the city, where the neighbors still wave from their driveways and the trees are old enough to have opinions. I spent 35 years teaching history at a Davidson County public school, which means I spent 35 years watching people ignore lessons that could have saved them a great deal of trouble. I retired with a pension of $2,340 a month, a house on Ridgecrest Drive that I've owned since 1989, and a belief that a man's home is, at minimum, his home. I was a patient teacher. I kept detailed records. I remembered everything my students ever tried to get away with. Those habits, it turned out, would come in handy far later than I expected. I should talk about Christopher. He's my son, 38 years old, works as a mid-level logistics manager, earns $74,000 a year, and plays golf on weekends with colleagues he calls friends, and probably doesn't like. He's not a bad man, Christopher. That's the part that makes it complicated. He's just a man who slowly, quietly chose comfort over character, the way a house settles over decades, so gradually you don't notice the cracks, until one day the foundation shifts and suddenly nothing is level anymore. He didn't used to be like this. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to understand what was lost. When Christopher was 11, he used to follow me into the garage and watch me work. I carve wood, furniture, decorative pieces, anything with grain and weight and patience required. I also collect antique maps of the United States, framed along the walls of my study. Christopher used to stand at my shoulder while I carved and ask me questions about the old maps. Why did states look different? What was here before the highways? Who decided where the borders went? He was curious in a way that made me proud, a boy who wanted to understand how things were built. He married Nicole 4 years ago. Nicole Wells, now Nicole Fosters, is 35, sharp-featured, and fluent in the language of subtle control. She's a real estate manager who earns $91,000 a year and runs an Instagram account about home renovation. She has 14,000 followers. I know this because she mentioned it 11 times in the first year of the marriage. She is not unintelligent. In fact, that's the problem. Nicole is the kind of person who calculates the return on investment of every relationship she enters, and at some point, she looked at me and decided I was a depreciating asset. The first signs were small, the living room furniture, dark oak pieces I'd built myself over 2 decades, was replaced within 6 months of them moving in. "We want something more modern, Ed." My workbench in the garage got pushed to the back corner to make room for Nicole's staging materials. Boxes of fabric samples, paint swatches, cabinet hardware. "Just temporarily, Ed." My study, which had always been my study, started being referred to as the guest room in Nicole's conversations. Not to my face at first. I heard it through walls. "We can turn the guest room into a proper rental once we get things sorted." Things sorted. I noticed all of this. I wrote none of it down yet. I was still being a good sport. That changed on Christmas morning. I had been awake since 6. Old habit. 35 years of first bell at 7:15 will rewire a man permanently. I made coffee, fed the bird feeder in the backyard, and spent an hour in the garage with a piece of black walnut I'd been shaping into a small decorative shelf. Christopher was still asleep. Nicole was not. I heard the back door open and close. Then again. Then a third time. I stepped out of the garage and saw her standing at the curb next to the recycling bins. 3 cardboard boxes. My boxes. I recognized the handwriting on the sides, my own, from when I'd packed them during a minor reorganization 2 summers ago. She was brushing her palms together the way people do after completing a task. "Nicole!" My voice came out even. I was proud of that. What is in those boxes? She turned around without any particular urgency. Old stuff from the back of the hall closet. Photo albums. Some tools. A tin box. I don't know what's in it. We're starting the renovation next week, and we need the storage space. It's just clutter, Ed. The tin box, she didn't know what was in. That tin box contained my father's military service medals. I looked at the 3 boxes sitting beside the garbage cans on Christmas morning. I looked at the woman who had moved into my house 2.5 years ago, who had not paid $1 of rent in those 2.5 years, who had replaced my furniture and relocated my workbench, and rebranded my study as a rental property, and was now standing at my curb, telling me that my father's medals were clutter. I did not raise my voice. I'm a teacher. Teachers learn quickly that silence is louder than shouting. I walked to the curb. I picked up all 3 boxes. They were heavy, but I managed, and carried them back inside to my bedroom without a word. Nicole watched me the whole way. She said something about the renovation schedule. I didn't respond. I set the boxes down next to my dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one I rarely opened, the one with the hanging file folders, and I pulled out a manila envelope. Inside that envelope was the deed of trust for 2847 Ridgecrest Drive, Nashville, Tennessee. My name, only my name. Purchased September 14th, 1989, for $112,000. Mortgage closed in full, June 2011. No liens, no cosigners, no complications. I set it on the nightstand. Outside, I could hear Nicole on the phone, talking to someone about tile samples. I sat with that manila envelope for a long time. The documents inside weren't complicated. A deed of trust, the original purchase agreement from 1989, a letter from the mortgage company confirming final payoff. Everything clean, everything mine. I've handled enough paperwork in my life to know what I was looking at. The paper equivalent of a foundation, the part of a structure that doesn't move. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Nicole about 14 months earlier. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October, one of those gray Tennessee days that can't decide if it wants to rain. Christopher was out with his golf friends. Nicole had come to find me in the garage, which was unusual. She generally treated the garage the way diplomats treat contested territory, acknowledged but not entered. She'd leaned against the doorframe with a coffee mug and what I can only describe as a rehearsed casualness. Ed, I've been thinking about the house, about long-term security for all of us. A pause that was meant to feel spontaneous. Have you ever considered putting Christopher on the deed, just as a co-owner? It would simplify things eventually, for taxes, for inheritance, for everything really. It would just make the whole situation more official. I had looked at the piece of cedar I was working with. I turned it over in my hands. I said, I'll think about it, which is what I say when I have no intention of thinking about it, but want the conversation to end. She'd smiled and gone back inside. I never mentioned it to Christopher. I don't know if he knew she asked. It didn't matter. The answer was the same either way. That October conversation came back to me sharply, sitting on my bed on Christmas morning with the deed in my lap. Nicole hadn't been asking out of sentimentality. She'd been conducting a real estate transaction. The house was worth somewhere around $385,000 at that point. I'd seen the neighborhood comparables. Getting Christopher's name on that deed would have changed everything. Inheritance, leverage, the entire geometry of who had rights to what. I had said I'd think about it. She had taken that as a soft no and moved on to other methods. The renovation, the storage, the recycling bins. I put the folder back in the drawer. The next day, Christopher apologized. He found me in the kitchen making eggs, sat down at the table, and said, Dad, I'm sorry about yesterday. Nicole was under a lot of stress about the project timeline. It was the apology of a man completing an assigned task. Technically present, emotionally absent. He made eye contact for approximately 4 seconds. Then he poured himself coffee and checked his phone. Nicole did not apologize. That evening I sat at the dinner table and ate vegetable soup, while Nicole explained to Christopher, with the detailed authority of someone presenting a business proposal, her plans for the renovation, new flooring throughout, updated kitchen cabinetry, and the guest room she said, gesturing generally in the direction of my study, would become a proper short-term rental. The Airbnb market in Bellevue is actually quite strong right now. I've been doing research. A well-staged room could bring in $1,800 a month easily. She said all of this while I was sitting 3 feet away from her, eating soup. Christopher nodded. He said, "That makes sense." Twice. He didn't look at me. I finished my soup. I rinsed the bowl. I said good night. I went to my bedroom and closed the door and stood there for a moment in the quiet. I thought about a classroom I'd taught in for 19 years. Room 214, second floor, Eastern exposure, good morning light. I thought about how many times I'd watched a student decide they already knew the answer before reading the question. The confidence of people who haven't learned yet that documents are more durable than assumptions. There's an 1887 map of Tennessee framed above my workbench in the garage. I bought it at an estate sale in Franklin 20 years ago for $60. The boundaries are slightly different from the modern state. Some of the county lines were still being disputed. A few towns have different names, and the river courses are drawn from survey measurements that weren't always precise. But the fundamentals are there. The shape of the thing. What belongs to what? I thought about that map. I thought about the deed in my bottom drawer. I thought about the fact that Christopher and Nicole had been living in my house, free of charge, for 2 years and 7 months. No lease, no rental agreement, no paperwork of any kind establishing their right to be there beyond my verbal invitation. An invitation that, under Tennessee law, I had the right to withdraw. I opened my laptop. I typed, "Real estate attorney, Nashville, Tennessee." The first few results were the usual large firm advertisements. But on the second page, or maybe it was a sidebar, I don't remember exactly, I found a listing on a legal rating site called Avo, Dennis Cole, attorney, real estate and trust law, office at 315 Dederick Street, Suite 72. Oh, Nashville. Rated 9.4 out of 10. 17 client reviews. The most recent one said simply, "He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he did it cleanly." I read that twice. I wrote down the address on a notepad I keep next to the laptop. Old teacher habit. If it matters, write it down. I closed the computer and turned off the lamp. In the garage, my workbench sat pushed into the back corner, where Nicole's staging boxes had relocated it 3 months ago. The black walnut piece I'd been shaping that morning was still on the bench, half finished. I'd get back to it. But first, I had some paperwork to put in order. The elevator in the building at 315. Dederick Street was slow and smelled faintly of old carpet. I stood in it with my manila envelope tucked under one arm and watched the numbers climb to 7. A week and a half had passed since Christmas morning. I'd called the number from Avo 3 days after finding it, made an appointment, and spent the intervening days doing what I'd spent 35 years training students to do. I gathered my primary sources. The deed, the mortgage payoff letter, the original purchase agreement from 1989, bank statements covering the previous 30 months. Specifically, the complete absence of any payment from Christopher or Nicole toward household expenses, utilities, or anything resembling rent. I also printed the relevant section of Tennessee landlord-tenant law, which I'd found on the state legislature's website. I like to arrive prepared. It's a habit that irritates people who are hoping you wouldn't be. Suite 720 was a clean, moderate office. Not flashy, not threadbare. A small waiting area with 3 chairs and a window overlooking the Cumberland River. The receptionist was efficient and indifferent in equal measure. I waited 11 minutes, which I spent rereading my notes. Dennis Cole was 54, with close-cropped gray hair and the measured calm of someone who has spent decades listening to people describe problems they should have addressed years earlier. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and said, "Tell me the situation." I told him. I kept it factual in the order it happened. The house, the marriage, the 2.5 years, the lack of any written agreement, the renovation plans, the boxes at the curb on Christmas morning. I did not editorialize. I simply described events and let them carry their own weight. Cole listened without interrupting. He made 2 brief notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he set his pen down and said, "Mr. Foster, under Tennessee Code. Annotated Section 66-28-512. Occupants without a written lease are classified as tenants at will. That means they can be asked to vacate with 30 days written notice. No court filing required at that stage. The notice itself is sufficient to initiate the process. If they refuse to leave after 30 days, then you file an unlawful detainer action. But in most cases, with a properly served notice, it doesn't get that far. I said, and if they claim there was a verbal agreement for permanent residency? He allowed a slight pause that was probably meant to convey professional patience. Verbal agreements regarding real property are largely unenforceable in Tennessee without written documentation. They can claim it. It wouldn't get them far. I nodded. I'd expected that answer, but there's a difference between suspecting something and having an attorney confirm it to your face. Then Cole raised the second issue, which I hadn't anticipated. He asked about my estate plan. Did I have a will? A trust? Any formal document indicating what should happen to the property at 2847 Ridgecrest Drive when I was no longer able to manage it? I did not. He explained it plainly. Without a trust, my estate would pass through probate after my death. As my only surviving child, Christopher would be the primary heir under Tennessee intestacy law. The house, my house, the one I'd bought in 1989 for $112,000 and paid off by 2011, would transfer to him automatically, to them effectively. I sat with that for a moment. What are my options? I asked. A revocable living trust, he said. You transfer the property into the trust now while you're living. You remain the trustee, full control during your lifetime. You designate a beneficiary. When you pass, the property goes directly to that beneficiary without going through probate at all. Christopher would have no automatic claim. And the notice to vacate? I can draft both documents. You choose when to serve the notice. I'll have them ready within 2 weeks. I wrote a check for $350, the consultation fee, and shook his hand again at the door. He said he'd be in touch when the drafts were ready. I took the slow elevator back down. I drove home along the Cumberland through the gray January afternoon, thinking about probate and tenants at will and the expression on Dennis Cole's face when I described the Christmas morning scene. Not shock. Men in his profession don't shock easily. Something more like quiet recognition. The look of someone who has heard this particular category of story before and knows exactly how it ends. I turned on to Ridgecrest Drive. My workbench was on the driveway, not pushed to the edge of the garage, not moved to the sidewall. On the driveway in the January cold, with a light drizzle falling on the wood surface. The piece of black walnut I'd been shaping, the one I'd been working on Christmas morning, was sitting on top of it, getting wet. I parked, got out, and stood there looking at it for a moment. Then I carried the workbench back inside. It took 3 trips to manage the whole thing properly. It's a heavy piece, solid oak, built to last. I set it back in its corner. I dried off the walnut piece with a shop rag and checked it for warping. It was fine. I was still standing in the garage, examining the wood grain, when I heard the door from the kitchen open. Nicole's voice came in sharp and immediate. "Ed, what are you doing? We needed that space." "The contractors start floor measurements this week. The garage has to be clear." I set the walnut piece down and turned around. She was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing the expression she used when she wanted to look reasonable while issuing a directive. Christopher was behind her in the kitchen holding the coffee mug. He did not say anything. I looked at Nicole for a moment. Then I said, "This is my garage. I'll say this one time." She opened her mouth. I said, "Once." She closed it. 4 seconds of silence, longer than it sounds. Then she turned and walked back into the kitchen. Christopher followed without making eye contact. I turned back to my workbench. Here is what I understood, standing there. The confrontation hadn't resolved anything. It had only marked a boundary. Nicole had noted where the line was, and she would now work around it rather than through it. She doesn't retreat. She recalculates. I'd been watching her recalculate for 4 years. I just hadn't been keeping written records until now. The thing about teaching history is that it trains you to look backward, to understand forward. Every event has a precedent. Every pattern has a starting point. I spent the days after Christmas constructing a clear timeline, not in my head where feelings distort sequence, but on paper where facts sit still. The first call I made was to a property appraiser. Robert Payne, certified appraiser for Davidson County, member of the same Bellevue Homeowners Association I'd attended twice, before concluding the meetings weren't worth my evenings. We weren't friends. We'd exchanged maybe 40 words in 4 years. But he was professional, local, and available, and I needed a current documented valuation of the property. He walked the house for 40 minutes with a clipboard and a measuring tape. The formal appraisal report arrived 6 days later, $391,500, higher than I'd estimated. The Bellevue neighborhood had appreciated steadily. I filed the report with the deed. The second call was back to Dennis Cole. The drafts were ready. I returned to Suite 720 and reviewed both documents carefully. The notice to vacate was straightforward. A formal written notice to Christopher and Nicole Foster, requiring them to vacate the premises within 30 days of service. Proper Tennessee statute language. Notarization ready. The living trust required more thought. I would transfer the property into the Edward J. Foster Revocable Living Trust, myself as trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. Upon my death, the property would go to a named external beneficiary. I had been thinking about this. I chose the Tennessee State Library and Archives Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving historical records and maps from across the state. I had spent a career teaching people to value primary sources. The 1887 map of Tennessee above my workbench was, in its own way, exactly that. Let the house serve that purpose. Cole witnessed the signature. A notary from the office down the hall stamped the document. I wrote a check for $875. The notice to vacate. I took home in a sealed envelope, unsigned, to be served when I chose. I said nothing to Christopher or Nicole. Life in the house continued in its pattern. Contractors came and went. The kitchen tile, old terracotta I'd laid myself in 1997, was stripped. Christopher left for work each morning and came back at 6. On weekends, he played golf. I carved. I read. I watched. One evening, I picked up the shared tablet from the kitchen counter. We'd used it for grocery lists, a practical arrangement that had since become mostly Nicole's device. I was looking for a restaurant menu I'd bookmarked. Instead, the browser was open to an Airbnb listing, cozy private room in quiet Bellevue neighborhood, tastefully renovated, shared kitchen and living area, available March 1st, $1,800 per month. The photographs were of my study. The listing had been created 4 days earlier. The room wasn't finished yet. The renovation was still underway. She had posted my room in my house, from which she had no legal standing to collect $1, before she'd even finished repainting it. I set the tablet back exactly where I'd found it. I went to my bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer. I looked at the sealed envelope. Then I opened my notepad and wrote down the listing date and the asking price, $1,800 per month. I underlined it twice. A teacher recognizes the moment a student commits an error that can't be walked back. Not careless, revealing. The kind that shows you exactly what someone was planning from the beginning. I had it in writing now. I also had something else. A second appointment with Cole, already scheduled for the following Monday. The sealed envelope. An appraiser's report. 30 months of bank statements showing zero. Not a single payment toward rent, utilities, or property tax from either of them. And now an Airbnb listing dated before the renovation was complete, advertising my house as available rental income. Nicole had spent 4 years treating this house as an asset she was simply waiting to inherit. She had listed it like a property manager before she'd finished staging it. She had moved my workbench into the rain while my father's medals were sitting in a cardboard box at the curb. I didn't know yet precisely when I would use the envelope, but I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew what came next. The week before I left, I moved my life out in layers. I had signed the lease on a studio apartment on the east side of Nashville. First floor, 1 large room, a small kitchen, a bathroom with decent water pressure. $1,150 a month, available from the 1st of February. The landlord was a quiet man named Gary who managed 3 properties in the neighborhood and had no interest in small talk. We shook hands. I wrote the deposit check, and that was the extent of our relationship. The apartment was clean and plain and entirely mine. No one else's name on the door. I drove back to Ridgecrest Drive that evening and stood in the garage for a while, looking at what I had accumulated in 35 years of living in one place. A man who stays put long enough ends up with layers of himself, pressed into corners and shelves and the backs of closets. Tools he used once and kept, books he meant to reread, maps he bought at estate sales in small Tennessee towns, rolled in cardboard tubes and stacked against the south wall of the garage. I began making decisions: what I needed, the documents, the laptop, my medications, blood pressure, nothing dramatic, 2 pills in the morning, my father's carving knife, which I had retrieved from the tin box Nickel had set at the curb, and which had been in the Foster family since 1951. 2 photographs, one of my parents taken at the 1964 World's Fair, and one of Christopher at age 8, standing in the garage doorway in a green jacket, watching me work. I have carried that photograph in my wallet for 30 years, and I saw no reason to stop. The rest, the maps, the furniture, the workbench, the tools, I moved gradually over 4 days. Each morning after Christopher left for his office, and Nicole drove away for whatever she had scheduled, I loaded the truck and made a run to the east side. The studio was small enough that I had to make choices. I kept the 1887 Tennessee map. I kept the carving tools. I left the armchair and most of the kitchen equipment, which was all too large for the new space anyway. By the morning of the Wednesday I'd chosen, the room that Nicole had been calling the guest room contained only my bed frame, a dresser I wasn't taking, and a cardboard box of items too small to bother moving. If Nicole had walked in, she might have thought I was already halfway gone. She would have been correct. I was up at 6. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the bird feeder in the backyard. A pair of house finches was working through the seed I'd filled it the day before, which struck me as a reasonable use of a Wednesday morning, better than most things a person does before 7 a.m. Nicole had been telling people the renovation was about improving the house. That's the phrase she'd used with the contractors, with her Instagram followers, with whoever she'd been texting during our dinners. Improvement, as though the house had been failing before she arrived, as though 35 years of a man's work on a building didn't count as improvement, simply because it wasn't photographed and posted anywhere. Christopher appeared in the doorway at 7, dressed for work. He looked at me, looked at his phone, said, "Morning," without particular attention, poured coffee from the pot I'd made, and left 12 minutes later. Nicole was out the door by 7:40, phone already at her ear, something about a showing in Green Hills. I waited until both cars were gone and the street was quiet. Then I went to my room and picked up the duffel bag I'd packed the night before. I did a walkthrough of the house, not sentimental, practical. I was checking that I had left nothing I would regret leaving. The bottom drawer of the dresser was empty. The tin box with my father's medals was already on the shelf above my new desk in the East Nashville studio. The carving knife was in the bag. The photographs were in my jacket pocket. I stood in the hallway for a moment. 35 years. I bought this house the year Christopher started kindergarten. I put in the kitchen tile in 1997 with a rented tile saw and a neighbor named Doug, who moved to Arizona in 2003. I planted the 2 oak trees in the backyard in 1995, and they were now taller than the roof line. I was not leaving the house. The house was still mine. I was simply removing myself from it, the way you step back from a situation to see it clearly. I walked to the kitchen. I set the duffel bag on the floor. I took the sealed envelope from my jacket pocket. White, standard business size. Dennis Cole's return address in the upper left corner. And I placed it on the kitchen table at Christopher's usual seat, where he could not possibly miss it. I picked up the duffel bag. I locked the front door behind me. My Ford F-150 was in the driveway. I put the bag in the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out onto Ridgecrest Drive. At the corner of Ridgecrest and Maple Ridge, I stopped at the sign. Force of habit. I've stopped at that sign 10,000 times. In the rearview mirror, The house sat at the end of the block, the way it always had. Tan siding, dark green shutters, the 2 oaks visible over the roofline. I pulled away. By the time I reached the I-40 on-ramp heading east, I realized I hadn't looked in the mirror again. The studio apartment on the east side of Nashville was quiet, in a way the Ridgecrest house hadn't been in years. No contractors, no renovation discussions, no footsteps on hardwood at 11 at night, while Nicole reviewed Airbnb pricing on her phone. Just the ambient sound of the neighborhood. Cars on the street below, someone's dog, the refrigerator's low hum. I ate a sandwich I'd made that morning, still packed in the bag. I turned on the television, found a documentary about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and watched it while the afternoon light shifted across the wall. At 6:47 in the evening, my phone rang. Christopher. I set the phone face up on the coffee table and watched his name appear and disappear. The call went to voicemail. He did not leave a message. 30 seconds later, it rang again. I looked at the screen. Christopher again. I set it back down. The documentary had moved on to a segment about the workers who laid the tracks through the Sierra Nevada. It was interesting enough to hold my attention. The phone rang 4 more times in the next 11 minutes, all from Christopher's number. Then it stopped for a while. At 7:22, a different number. I didn't recognize it. Then again. Then a third time from the same number. I looked it up. It matched a number Nicole had used once to call about a plumbing issue when her regular phone was charging. She had found the envelope. The text started around 7:30. I read them in order because I believe in primary sources. Christopher, first message. What is this? Call me back. Christopher, second message, 3 minutes later. Dad, seriously, call me. Then a gap of about 8 minutes. Probably the 2 of them reading the notice to vacate together, working through the language. It's a clear document, but people tend to read things twice when the news is bad. Nicole's first text came in at 7:41. It was 4 lines. Calm, measured, the tone of someone who works in real estate and knows how to phrase things carefully. Ed, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I'd really like to talk before either of us does anything we can't take back. Can you call me? I had to give her credit for the attempt. 4 years of watching Nicole operate had taught me that her first instinct under pressure was always to reframe the situation, to establish that everything was still negotiable, that the conversation was still open, that no one had actually done anything yet. It was a professional skill. She used it on clients. She was using it on me now. I did not respond. Christopher's messages escalated faster than Nicole's. By 8 o'clock, he had sent 11 texts. The progression was almost textbook, the kind of emotional arc I'd seen in students who got caught having not done the assignment and were trying to work through their options in real time. First came the challenge. This isn't legal. You can't just tell us to leave. Then the appeal. Talk to me. Please, we're family. Then the bargain. I'll call you in the morning and we can figure this out. Just pick up. Then around 9, something that was either an attempt at guilt or genuine distress. I couldn't fully tell, which was itself somewhat telling. We have nowhere to go. You know that, right? I read that one twice. They earned $74,000 and $91,000 per year. Between them, $165,000 annually before taxes. They had been living rent-free in my house for 2.5 years. The number of places they had to go was, in fact, not 0. By 10 o'clock, the calls had reached 112. I know this because I counted them the next morning. The call log on my phone is efficient that way. Christopher, Nicole, and Nicole's second number in rotation, sometimes back-to-back, sometimes in clusters of 3 or 4 within a minute. At some point around 11, Nicole sent the long message I had expected. It ran about 200 words. The core of it was this. She had always had the best intentions for the house. The renovation was meant to benefit everyone. She had invested significant time and personal resources into making improvements, and if there was a problem with how things had been managed, she was completely open to sitting down and addressing it like adults. She did not mention the Christmas boxes. She did not mention the workbench in the rain. She did not mention the Airbnb listing she had posted from my tablet in my house before she had any right to post it. She also didn't mention my father's medals I put the phone down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The documentary about the railroad was long over. Outside, East Nashville was going about its evening. I lay in the dark in my new apartment. First night in a place that was simply mine, uncomplicated. And I thought about 35 years of payments and tile work and oak trees and one carving knife that had outlasted everything. I slept better than I had in months. In the morning, I made coffee, looked at the call log, and opened a new text to Christopher. I typed, "Contact a lawyer. You have 30 days." I pressed send. I set the phone down. Then I refilled my coffee and watched the house finch that had apparently followed me across the city land on the windowsill, look in briefly and fly away. I had not refilled the feeder yet. That was a reasonable complaint. I made a note to buy seed on my way back from the bank, where I had an appointment that afternoon with Sandra Torres to review the account documentation I'd need for the next step. The 30 days had started, and I had work to do. Dennis Cole called me on a Tuesday morning, about 10 days after I'd sent the text to Christopher. I was at my workbench in the studio. I'd set it up along the east wall, under the window, which got good morning light, shaping a piece of cherry wood into a small shelf bracket. Cole's voice was measured and professional, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it that I had learned to read as mild interest, the kind a lawyer gets when a case turns out to be slightly more complicated than expected. "They've retained counsel," he said. "Paul Bridges, out of a firm on West End Avenue. I've worked opposite him before. He's aggressive and not inexpensive, which tells you they're taking this seriously." I set down the carving knife. "What's their argument?" "Two things. First, they're claiming an oral agreement, that your invitation for them to move in constituted a long-term residency arrangement, not a temporary stay. Second, they're asserting a right to compensation for improvements made to the property. Nicole apparently has documentation of roughly $14,000 in renovation expenses over the past year." I was quiet for a moment. $14,000 in work done on my property, without a written permit from me, which she now wants me to pay back. That's the claim, yes. And what does Tennessee law say about improvements made to someone else's property without a written agreement? Cole made a sound that might have been the legal equivalent of a dry smile. "It says that without a written agreement establishing the nature of the arrangement, loan, gift, or investment, improvements made by an occupant to a property they don't own are generally considered a gift to the property owner. They bear the risk." "So she remodeled my kitchen as a gift." "Legally speaking, yes." I told him to respond accordingly. He said he would have a letter to Bridges' office by end of week. I thanked him, hung up, and went back to the cherrywood. I was not surprised by the lawyer. The dollar figure, $14,000, was higher than I'd estimated. It meant Nicole had been more committed to the renovation than I'd realized, more certain of her position. She had spent that money believing the house was already hers in every way that mattered. She had been wrong. The second call came 3 days later from a number I didn't immediately recognize. When I answered, a woman identified herself as Barbara Mansfield, my neighbor from 2 houses down on Ridgecrest Drive. I had spoken with Barbara perhaps a dozen times over the years. She was in her mid-60s, kept a meticulous garden, and had strong opinions about the neighborhood association's parking policy. We were not close, but we were civil. "Edward," she said, and her tone told me before the words did that something was off. "I'm calling because I think you should know what's being said on the street." She told me that Nicole had been talking to neighbors. Not everyone, selectively the ones most likely to be sympathetic or to spread the information further. The story Nicole was telling was this. Edward Foster had become erratic in recent months. He had become difficult to live with, paranoid, possibly confused. The family had been trying to help him, letting him stay in the house, managing his affairs, keeping the property in good condition. And now, out of nowhere, he had served them with eviction papers and disappeared. They were worried about him. They didn't know what had gotten into him. She used the phrase, "not himself," Barbara said, more than once. I thanked her and asked if she would be willing to repeat this conversation if it ever became relevant. She said she would. I wrote down the date, the time, the substance of what she'd told me, and set it in the folder with the rest of the documentation. This was, I recognized, a reasonably well-designed move. If a judge or anyone else were to look at the situation and find a narrative of a confused older man acting erratically, it would complicate the picture. It wouldn't change the legal facts. The deed was the deed, but it could affect perception. Nicole was working every angle she had. I had expected her to work angles. I had not been idle while she did. A week after Cole's call about Bridges, Cole called again. His tone was still measured, but the mild interest had sharpened into something more like attention. They're not backing down. Bridges has filed a motion to extend the response period and is requesting a hearing. They want a judge to evaluate the oral agreement claim and the improvement compensation claim simultaneously. Which means court, I said. Which means court. Davidson County General Sessions. I'd expect a hearing date within 4 to 6 weeks. I told him I'd be ready. After I hung up, I sat for a while at the kitchen table in the studio with a cup of coffee and the folder in front of me. In it, the deed, the mortgage payoff letter, 30 months of bank statements, the appraisal report, the living trust documentation, Barbara Mansfield's account in writing, and the printed screenshot of Nicole's Airbnb listing, time-stamped, showing the posting date and the $1,800 per month asking price, created before I had left the house. That last document was the one I thought about most. Nicole was a real estate manager. She understood listings. She understood that a listing creates a record, a time-stamped, publicly accessible record of intent. She had posted that listing on a platform that logged the creation date automatically. She had done it from a tablet in my house, while I was still living there, before the renovation she was advertising was even complete. She had, in a professional sense, documented her own intentions before she had the right to act on them. I closed the folder and finished my coffee. The hearing was 4 weeks away. I had everything I needed. Davidson County General Sessions Court is not a dramatic space. Fluorescent lighting, rows of seating, a raised bench at the front, the atmosphere of a place where ordinary disputes arrive to be resolved. I had never been inside it before. Cole and I arrived early and reviewed the documents once more. Christopher and Nicole came in shortly after, with Paul Bridges, their attorney, late 40s, thick file, the practiced confidence of a man who wins by preparation and aggression in roughly equal measure. Nicole carried 3 folders, photographs, receipts, contractor invoices, organized with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this presentation. She did not look at me when she came in. Christopher looked at me once, briefly, then away. Judge Marion Gates, compact, 50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, came in, read the case summary, and said, "Let's proceed." Bridges led. His argument had 2 pillars, an oral agreement for long-term residency and the right to compensation for property improvements. $14,000 documented through bank records and contractor invoices. He argued that Nicole had spent this money in reasonable reliance on an implicit understanding that the Fosters had a stable right to remain at the property. Nicole supported him as a witness, presenting calmly and fluently. She described the renovation work as a cooperative contribution, time, money, effort invested in improving a shared home. She was good at constructing a credible version of events, I will say that plainly. Then Cole stood up. He placed 3 documents on the table and walked Judge Gates through them one at a time. First, the deed of trust for 2847 Ridgecrest Drive, signed in 1989. Single owner, Edward Joseph Foster. No co-signers, no amendments. Second, 30 months of bank statements. In 30 months of shared occupancy, there was not a single payment from Christopher or Nicole toward rent, utilities, or property taxes. Not one. Every household expense had been paid by Edward Foster's pension and savings. Third, a printed screenshot of an Airbnb listing. The platform's timestamp was visible at the top. The listing advertised a private room at 2847 Ridgecrest Drive for $1,800 per month, available from March 1st. It had been created 6 days before Edward Foster left the property. Cole said, "The respondents claim they were caught off guard by Mr. Foster's departure. This listing was posted before he left, suggesting a plan for the property that preceded the notice to vacate, not a response to it. The courtroom was quiet. I watched Nicole's face. She was skilled at control, but control under genuine surprise is different from control under prepared pressure. For 2 seconds, something involuntary passed across her expression, a compression around the eyes, a tightening at the jaw, the look of someone who has just watched a document they created land on a judge's table. Christopher sat very still. Judge Gates examined the Airbnb printout, looked up, and asked Nicole directly whether the listing was hers. Nicole said yes. The judge made a note. The hearing ran 40 minutes. Judge Gates's ruling was direct. The court confirmed Edward Foster's right to reclaim his property under Tennessee law. Christopher and Nicole Foster were granted an additional 21 days to vacate voluntarily, after which a formal eviction order would be filed. Nicole's claim for renovation compensation was denied. Without a written agreement, improvements made to a property by an occupant who doesn't own it cannot be recovered from the property owner. Bridges said something to Nicole in a low voice. Her posture shifted, the stillness of someone absorbing a result and deciding what to do next. Christopher looked at me across the aisle, not past me, not through me, at me directly in the way you look at someone when you have finally finished understanding something you should have understood much earlier. In the hallway afterward, while Cole handled the paperwork, Christopher walked over. He stopped a few feet away and didn't speak immediately. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said quietly, "I taught kids to read documents before drawing conclusions. It's a habit that pays off." He didn't answer. He stood there a few seconds, nodded once, not agreement exactly, not concession, something harder to name, and walked back toward Nicole and their attorney. Bridges was already talking to Nicole in a low voice near the door, his hands moving in the way attorneys' hands move when they are managing a client's disappointment. She was nodding, her expression composed, the mask back in place, but it was the kind of composure that requires effort, and I could see the effort. I thought about the Christmas morning conversation. "This is just clutter, Ed." 3 boxes at the curb. The tin box with my father's medals. She had made that decision with the calm certainty of someone who believed there would be no accounting for it. There is always an accounting. Sometimes it just takes time to arrive. Cole appeared at my shoulder. As clean a result as I've seen. "Clean facts," I said. We walked out into the afternoon. Across the city on the east side, my workbench was waiting, and there was a shelf bracket half finished in cherry wood. 21 days before they'd be gone from Ridgecrest Drive, and then I'd have a house to return to. Mine, as it had always been. I drove home thinking about oak trees. The 2 I'd planted in the backyard in 1995 were taller than the roofline now. Some things you tend carefully, and they outlast everything else you put your effort into. I had always known that about trees. It turned out to be true about a few other things as well. 21 days passed. I know because I counted them, the way you count the days before a deadline when you have spent a long time preparing for it. Each morning I got up in the East Nashville studio, made coffee, worked on the cherrywood shelf bracket, and checked my phone for messages I had decided not to respond to. Christopher sent 4 texts in those 3 weeks. Nicole sent none, which told me she had shifted into a different mode, something colder and more strategic than texts. I wasn't sure what she was planning. I didn't lose sleep over it. On the morning of the deadline, I drove to Ridgecrest Drive. I parked at the curb. The moving truck was already gone. They had apparently done that part the day before, quietly, without announcing it. The house sat the way it always had from the outside. Tan siding, dark green shutters, the 2 oaks over the roofline. From the street, nothing had changed. From the street, it never looked like anything was happening inside. I used my key. The first thing I noticed was the kitchen floor. The terracotta tile I had laid in 1997 was gone. Stripped down to bare concrete subfloor in a rough oval pattern around the center of the room, with the edges unfinished, as though the project had been abandoned mid-process, which it had. The cabinets on the north wall had been repainted a shade of gray-white that looked acceptable in isolation but clashed with everything around it. 3 cabinet doors were missing entirely. There were pry marks on the baseboards. I walked through the house with my phone, photographing everything. The living room walls had been patched in 2 places with joint compound that had not been sanded or painted. The bedroom Nicole had been calling the guest room had new vinyl plank floors, the one completed improvement. I photographed it anyway. The garage was the worst. Bags of construction debris, a broken tile saw no one had returned, stacks of cardboard, a bucket of grout that had dried solid. The south wall where I stored my map tubes was bare. I stood there a moment before remembering I had moved those myself weeks ago. They were already on the shelf above my workbench in the studio. I completed the walkthrough. I had 43 photographs and a list of deficiencies. That afternoon, I drove to First Tennessee Bank's Bellevue branch and met with Sandra Torres, the office manager who had helped me with the account documentation earlier in the process. She was efficient and professional and had no particular interest in the details of my family situation, which I appreciated. I needed a formal statement of the account balance as of that day and one additional document prepared for the next step. She had both ready in 20 minutes. The following week, I met with Dennis Cole. We went through the photographs and a contractor's written estimate, $8,700 to restore the kitchen floor, complete the wall repairs, repaint, and clear the garage. Cole drafted a formal demand letter to Christopher for $8,700 restitution, with a 30-day response window before civil action. Christopher received it and did not respond for 2 weeks. Then he called Cole's office and asked about a payment plan. Cole called me to relay the conversation. "He wants to pay in installments," Cole said. "He mentioned $500 a month." "That works," I said. "Have him sign a promissory note." Cole prepared the document. Christopher signed it. 17 months at $500 per month. $8,500 total, with the remaining $200 forgiven at completion in exchange for a signed release of any further claims. A clean instrument, the kind of thing that doesn't require trust to function because it's legally binding regardless. Meanwhile, I cleaned the garage, disposed of the construction debris, and spent 3 evenings restoring the room to something I could work in. I set the workbench back in its corner. I reattached the mounting brackets on the south wall and rehung the map tubes. The 1887 Tennessee map went back in its frame above the workbench. Then I turned my attention to the room Nicole had renovated. The vinyl plank floor was fine. The room was clean. It had a closet, a window facing east, and a reasonable amount of natural light in the morning. I spent 2 days furnishing it simply. A bed frame I'd had in storage, a small dresser, a lamp. I took photographs. I listed it on VRBO at $95 per night, describing it accurately. A quiet, private room in a Bellevue home, shared kitchen, no pets, minimum 2-night stay. The first booking came in 4 days later. A couple passing through Nashville for a long weekend, visiting family in the area. They left a 5-star review. Clean, quiet, comfortable. Host was pleasant and unobtrusive. Would stay again. I was not unaware of the irony. Nicole had listed this room for $1,800 a month before she had any right to list it. I was now renting it legitimately in my own house, generating income that was mine by every legal and moral measure available. Over the following 2 months, the room was occupied roughly half the nights. The net income, after the VRBO service fee, came to $4,180. I put it in a separate account. Then Nicole found out. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening. I was in the garage working. I saw it when I came inside. "Ed, I just heard you're renting out the room to strangers. After everything, how could you do that?" I read it once. I typed back 4 words. "It's my room, Nicole." I set the phone down and went back to the garage. 3 days later, Christopher called. Not a text, a call, which was unusual. I almost didn't answer. Then I picked up because something in the timing felt different. His voice was tired. Not the performative tiredness of someone making a point. Genuinely worn down, the way a person sounds when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have started to feel the weight of it. He said, "Dad, can we meet?" We met at a diner on Charlotte Pike, about a mile from the Ridgecrest house. A corner booth, morning light through the windows. The kind of place that has been in the same location since the 1980s, and sees no reason to change. Christopher was already there when I arrived. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked the way a man looks when he has rehearsed what he wants to say, and then, at the last moment, decided the rehearsed version wasn't right. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I waited. He said, "I need to say something, without Nicole here, without anyone else. Just me saying it." I nodded. "I let things go too far," he said. "Not just the eviction, all of it. The last 4 years. I kept telling myself it would work out, that you were fine, that Nicole just had strong opinions about the house, and I kept not looking at what was actually happening." He stopped. "I knew she moved your stuff to the curb on Christmas. I was asleep, but I heard her come back in. I didn't get up." He was quiet after that. I looked at my coffee for a moment. This was the part I had thought about. Not the documents, not the court date, not the VRBO listing. This part. What to do when the person you were angry at stopped being a problem to manage and became your son again, sitting in a diner booth looking like someone who had finally stopped lying to himself. I said, "You were there when it started. You could have stopped it earlier." "I know. The medals were in that box." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know, Dad." I let that sit. Then I said, "All right, what do you want?" He didn't want the house back. He was clear about that, as though he knew I needed to hear it first. He and Nicole had signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in the Antioch neighborhood, south of the city, $1,650 a month. They were managing it, though not easily. The combined cost of the apartment, the legal fees from the court case, and daily life had tightened things considerably. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking whether there was still a relationship available to them, to him and his father, or whether that was gone. I told him I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. We talked for an hour. He told me things about the past 4 years that I hadn't known, things Nicole had said to him privately, decisions she had made that he had gone along with, because disagreeing with her required effort he hadn't been willing to spend. He wasn't asking me to blame her for everything. He was trying to be accurate. I respected the attempt. Before we left, I put a document on the table. He looked at it. It was the promissory note, the one he had already signed, committing to $500 per month for 17 months. I had added a handwritten note at the bottom, initialed by me. Upon completion of repayment and continued good faith, the undersigned will be named as a conditional beneficiary in the Edward J. Foster Living Trust. He read it twice. His face did something complicated. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude. Something closer to the expression of a man who has been given a chance he isn't sure he deserves. "Conditional," I said. "I understand," he said. We shook hands across the table. Not warmly, not yet, but firmly, the way two people do when they have agreed on terms and both intend to keep them. I drove back to Ridgecrest Drive. The house was quiet. The kitchen subfloor was still bare concrete. I was waiting on a tile quote, but the garage was clean and the workbench was in its corner, and the morning light was coming through the east-facing window the way it had for 35 years. I put the kettle on. On the wall above the workbench, in the dark oak frame I'd built myself in 2003, was the 1887 map of Tennessee. I had pulled it from one of the cardboard tubes when I first moved back, unrolled it on the workbench, checked it for moisture damage, found none. I had cleaned the glass on the frame and rehung it that same afternoon. The map showed the state as it was surveyed in that year. County lines slightly different from today. A few town names that no longer exist. River courses drawn from measurements that weren't always precise. But the shape of the thing was right. The fundamentals were there. Tennessee was Tennessee. Bounded, defined, belonging to itself. Nicole had called it clutter. She had put it in a cardboard box and set it at the curb on a Christmas morning, next to my father's medals and my carving tools, with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided what had value and what didn't. She had been wrong about most things, but she had been wrong about that one with a particular completeness. I had known, standing on the garage threshold that morning, watching her walk back inside, that I would go back for the boxes. I hadn't said anything. There was nothing to say. I had simply waited, which is what you do when you know what you have, and you know what you're going to do about it. The kettle finished. I poured the coffee. I sat at the workbench with the cherrywood shelf bracket, finally finished after 4 months of interrupted work, and turned it over in my hands. Outside, the 2 oak trees in the backyard were moving in a light summer wind, planted in 1995, taller than the roofline now. Some things you build carefully, and they outlast everything that tried to displace them. 112 calls. I didn't answer a single one. Sometimes the loudest answer is silence, and 1 envelope on a kitchen table. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.
아니라 여기 심포시장은 그 뼈 있는 닭강정이에요. 뼈 있는 닭강정. 아, 추워. 여기 앉아있으니까 옛날에 부천에 앉아있던 때 생각나. 부천에도 이렇게 밖에 앉아가지고 막 이렇게 소통하고 그랬는데. 지나가는 사람들 만나고. 혼자 누구 들어가신다. 초밥집에.